My name is Daniel Horan, and I'm a professor of philosophy, religious studies, and theology, and I have the privilege of serving as the director of the Center for the Study of Spirituality here at St. Mary's College. I am delighted to welcome you to this event, but before introducing our guests, well, they're not really guests, they're hometown heroes, but we'll get to that in a minute. I do want to take a moment to say a few words about the center. Founded in 1984 by Dr. Keith Egan with the generous support from the Sisters of the Holy Cross, the Center for the Study of Spirituality is an academic research hub that offers events, programs, and conferences that promote the engagement between faith and reason and the connection between mind, body, and spirit. Committed to inclusion and dialogue, the center draws on intellectual resources in the Catholic and broader Christian heritage to develop critical conversations around contemporary religious and cultural issues, especially as they relate to women's experiences in society, the academy, and the church. Before proceeding, we wish to acknowledge that we are gathering on sacred land, and we wish to honor the native peoples who have been the traditional custodians of this place for generations. We particularly recognize the Pokagon Band of Potawatomi and the Miami, who have cared for this land and its resources for many generations and continue to do so today. With deep gratitude, we recognize our Indigenous siblings and their cultures within our community, as well as acknowledging the land upon which we gather, pray, learn, and work. The format for our program this afternoon is threefold. First, Dr. Feder will offer a brief presentation about her work. Next, our colleague, Dr. Jessica Coblentz, who is Associate Professor in the Department of Religious Studies and Theology here at St. Mary's College, and the author of the book, Dust in the Blood, A Theology of Life with Depression, will engage in a conversation on the themes of her book. Finally, we will open the floor for questions and comments from the in-person and virtual audiences. Just a reminder, so those who are joining us virtually, please send your comments and questions via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Also, a reminder that the campus bookstore, as you saw for those in person coming into the auditorium, the campus bookstore has copies of Dr. Feder's book available for sale in the lobby, and Dr. Feder will be around afterwards to greet you and gladly sign copies of her book. So stay tuned for that. We also recognize that some of the themes that may be discussed today, especially relating to sexual trauma, may affect folks differently. So please attend to your needs, those here in person and those joining us virtually. And for our students in a special way, know that there are additional resources at the Health and Wellness Center and through BAVO. Now it's my privilege to introduce our speaker today. Dr. Julia Feder is a Catholic feminist theologian who thinks and writes about human suffering. She is the Assistant Director of the Center for the Study of Spirituality and Associate Professor of Religious Studies and Theology here at St. Mary's College. Previously, she served as Associate Professor of Theology at Creighton University in Nebraska. From 2014 to 2016, she was a postdoctoral research fellow at the Center for Theology, Science, and Human Flourishing at the University of Notre Dame, where she was in formal dialogue with biological anthropologists about the centrality of symbol making in human evolution. She is currently co-principal investigator of the research project titled Just One Jesuit: Communities' Accounts of the Effects of Clergy Abuse Through the Lens of a Singular Priest's Mission Activities, which is funded by a grant from Fordham University's Taking Responsibility Project. In addition to her book, about which she'll speak this evening, her essays have been published in Theological Studies, Horizons, the Journal of Moral Theology, the Journal of Religion and Society, Anthropology News, and Philosophy, Theology, and the Sciences. So please join me in extending a warm St. Mary's College welcome to our colleague, Dr. Julia Feder.
Thanks for that introduction. I'm really happy to be here and to see so many of your faces, especially on such a cold evening. I really appreciate you coming. When I first started teaching theology to college students 10 years ago, I discovered that students are most interested in questions that try to make sense of suffering. They want to know, why have I experienced suffering? If I pray enough, will God protect me from suffering? Does God want us to suffer? Can suffering bring us closer to God? Sometimes I show my students a crafted bookmark that belonged to my mother in the early 1960s. I found it lodged between the pages of an old prayer book that she passed down to me. The bookmark, which you can see here, is a small rectangle of cream paper with red foil backing. And the cutout picture of Jesus pointing to his heart pasted in the corner. And underneath in gold script, it reads, it might be hard to see, but it says, "Do not fear suffering, for by enduring it, you can increase my glory and repair the sins of the world." I think this sentiment still feels familiar to my students who were raised in Christian households 50 years later. When I think of my mother who held this bookmark as she prayed in a church pew in South Philadelphia, and at the same time was being sexually abused in her own home, I know that the Christian tradition has terribly failed. It has failed her and so many other survivors who somehow received the message that traumatic suffering is a vehicle for God's saving grace. Violence does not add to God's glory. I wrote this book to try to contribute something to the process of saving our often broken ways of talking about God's grace in the Christian tradition. I do so by naming that which has fostered and normalized sexual violence in the Christian tradition and condemn it. And I also spend time unearthing, liberating resources buried in this tradition for describing God's healing work and empowering our participation in this work of healing. Those who experience the horror of sexual violence know that violent sexual acts can feel like they push against the natural order. The sexual violation of the bodies of children and teens can seem to threaten what can feel like a basic human instinct to protect and nurture youth. And the coercion of adults against their will into sexual act distorts what can feel like the natural beauty and easy joy of sexual coupling. This feeling of unnaturalness that accompanies sexual violence is in part what contemporary Christian thinkers mean when they talk about extreme suffering as senseless. The suffering of sexual violence serves no higher purpose or greater human value. This kind of suffering pushes against all ways of making sense of the world as good and orderly. And yet it would not be accurate to describe acts of sexual violence as against the natural order if this claim is meant to mean that they are exceptional or rare. More than half of women and almost 1 in 3 men in the United States describe themselves as having experienced sexual violence involving physical contact at some point in their lives. And sexual exploitation need not involve physical contact to be profoundly damaging to the victim. We can think of stalking, online forms of sexual harassment, and other forms of hands-off but powerfully coercive forms of sexual exploitation. What we once thought of as uncommon, we now know to be quite ordinary. Sexual violence is a salient feature of our common life together. It is widespread in our schools, our churches, and our homes. In the Christian tradition, salvation is the restoration of wholeness. Because sexual violence profoundly threatens human wholeness, post-traumatic healing is a matter of human salvation. Post-traumatic healing restores the relationships that have been damaged by sexual violence, the relationship that the survivor has with herself, with others, with the institutions in which she is embedded, and with God. In Incarnating Grace, I argue that healing from sexual trauma is a mystical political practice. That is to say that it is an often lifelong process that involves the reparation of one's relationships with God and one's relationships with one's communities. This mystical political practice is both incarnational and eschatological. By incarnational, I mean that post-traumatic healing is fully enfleshed and human. It is embodied, it is contextual, conditioned by history and circumstance, and by virtue of God's full embrace of human life and circumstance in the person of Jesus Christ, instilled with the Spirit. By eschatological, I mean that healing is partial and incomplete, requiring assistance from God and insufficient on its own terms, yet not desperately so. In the Christian tradition, the incomplete and failing state of things is not the final word. And because the Christian story is a story of the persistence of relationship in the face of violence, this tradition contains rich resources to animate the mystical political shape of post-traumatic healing. Ultimately, I argue that the fullness of post-traumatic healing that is required must draw from reserves that are deeper than that which can be articulated by the secular field of psychology alone. Healing requires eschatological hope. That is, hope that is grounded in the genuine expectation of God's creative transformation of human life and our free, creative, and courageous cooperation with God in bringing this transformation about. The healing that we require is deeply incarnational. Sexual violence harms our bodies. Bodies are personal. That is, my body is myself, and yet bodies are also interpersonal, social, and political. The context in which I am located shapes my body, namely the ways that I care for and cultivate my body, the ways that I and others interpret my body and make meaning with my body, and what happens to my body outside of my control. Bodies are never wholly individual or corporate. They are always at once both. The traumatic wounds of sexual violence, particularly insofar as they affect every area of human being, personal, interpersonal, social, political, physical, psychological, spiritual, are bodily in this fullest sense. Salvation, if it is to have anything to do with post-traumatic recovery, must involve the restoration of our bodies in this fullest sense. In each chapter, I return to a refrain. God does not want human beings to suffer. And this might sound obvious, I hope actually. But I found that there is a common Christian tendency to rationalize suffering. Nancy Nason-Clark, a sociologist who studies Christian responses to sexual violence, argues that Christians tend to offer two types of rationalizations in the face of sexual violence: individual-centered and God-centered. So in this first approach, individual-centered rationalization, Christians assume, either implicitly or explicitly, that grave suffering is a consequence of bad personal choices. So if one makes good choices and lives a good life, it is believed that one will be free from major suffering. Now, admittedly, even under this framework, good people might suffer from inconveniences or small-scale experiences of suffering, like the suffering of unrequited love or limited professional failures or waiting in line and things like that. But those who hold this position assume that good behavior protects one from the most significant forms of suffering, such as interpersonal violence or early death. When these assumptions about suffering are interpreted in the context of sexual violence, survivors can deduce that their experience of rape is evidence that they had somewhere in their lives prior to abuse made a bad choice. And this rape is the natural or perhaps even cosmic consequence of this choice. This interpretation of violence may give the survivor a sense of comfort to the degree that it can suggest that she is capable of controlling what happens to her. Namely, if she makes the right choices, this will not happen again. But ultimately, it carries more risks than benefits. It communicates that rape is the victim's fault. It obfuscates the culpability of the perpetrator, even perhaps deifying him as the agent of God's justice. It hides the social and structural forces that make sexual violence a common experience. And furthermore, it's simply not true that good personal moral choices ensure that individuals will be protected from violence. And to suggest this to a victim struggling to survive may set her up for failure, catastrophic disappointment, and re-traumatization. An alternative, though often related, common Christian interpretation of suffering is a God-centered rationalization. Suffering is allowed by God for reasons that are temporarily hidden to the sufferer, but ultimately at the service of some greater good. Jesus' death on the cross, willed by God so that human beings might be able to experience forgiveness for their sins, is often offered as a paradigm for this kind of suffering that's desired by God for reasons that are temporarily mysterious. Many who offer God-centered rationalizations will suggest everything happens for a reason, though we may not know what these reasons are. When this kind of interpretation of suffering is applied in a post-traumatic context, it might feel comforting for some of the same reasons that individual-centered explanations are. It suggests that however chaotic and unjust violence may feel, someone is in fact in control. Yet the risks in this kind of approach, again, outweigh any potential comfort that this may bring to victims. It portrays God as one who desires the suffering of human beings. It acculturates vulnerable people to accept abuse. It fails to create sufficient space to condemn interpersonal and social political harm as sinful, and it minimizes victims' genuine pain. As theologians Joanne Carlson Brown and Rebecca Parker have argued, the image of Christ as suffering in obedience to the Father's will is one in which divine child abuse is paraded as salvific, and the child who suffers without even raising a voice is lauded as the hope of the world. When Jesus' death is portrayed as both authentically excruciating and somehow for a meaningful end, those who have suffered abuse find it difficult to understand their own suffering as worthy of protest and may think that whatever they bear pales in comparison to the virtuous pain endured by Jesus. This understanding of suffering as fuel for growth, or worse, as the content of salvation itself, is deadly for those suffering from sexual violence. Sexual violence does not produce any good in victims. It is senseless suffering that has no structural place in the divine plan. Rape does not have any hidden benefit for victims. There is no divine reason for rape. There is no ultimate meaning in rape. It is human sin. It is tragedy in an ultimate sense. So how can we think theologically about healing from sexual violence? What are the resources that we have within our tradition to make sense of God's healing work in our lives and beyond our earthly lives? I argue that Teresa of Avila, the 16th century Spanish mystic who critiqued her society's obsession with honor and class distinction, can offer us a generative starting point for a mystical political theology of post-traumatic healing. She had a vision of the embodied human person as the imago Dei and a friend of God. And Teresa doesn't just offer the survival a mystical vision of post-traumatic healing, but also a vision of social and political post-traumatic healing, a transformation of her culture's patriarchal exchange of women's bodies as objects into networked communities of female friendship and mutual care. Teresa's understanding of the human person as the imago Dei clearly names the human person as possessive of an inherent beauty that, on the one hand, should be preserved and held sacred through precious care, yet, on the other, cannot be destroyed by maltreatment. Because the human person is fully embodied, and union with God for her represents the fullness of bodily integration rather than transcendence of the body, care for one's body and vulnerable others is integral to sacred fidelity to God. Yet, Teresa can suggest at times that experiences of suffering present opportunities to serve God. And I argue that this can risk suggesting that God desires human suffering. In a context of sexual violence, as I've mentioned, no suggestion could be more damaging to survivors. And so Teresa's thought needs the correction of contemporary theologians who have thought carefully about the absurdity of evil. So I turn to the writings of Edward Skillebix, the 20th century Catholic Flemish priest and theologian influential at Vatican II, who talks about human experiences of senseless suffering. Skillebix can remind us that if God is worthy of worship, God does not will human suffering and does not use suffering as a tool to bring about salvation. God is not disclosed in the crosses of our experience, but rather beside our crosses as an indignant witness. God is neither behind abuse, animating it, nor above abuse, indifferent to it. Instead, God is closely present to the survivor, making the absence of good known to her. In the last chapters of the book, I turn to two Christian virtues that can animate post-traumatic healing: courage and hope. Because of the long, comprehensive, and arduous nature of post-traumatic healing, many trauma psychologists have noted the importance of courage in the work of post-traumatic recovery. Secular trauma theorists recognize that healing relies in part upon courageous action taken by survivors, empowered by a hope for the future to pursue healing. In the context of this kind of violence, courage is a commitment to healing, however long, comprehensive, and arduous this process might become. I argue that Jesus models this kind of courage, not as a willing, suffering servant, but as one who resists the violence of the Roman Empire and assigns his own meaning to his life and work. Christian hope can provide a language to empower courageous activity undertaken toward healing that authentically expects something new, but is also grounded in a realistic understanding of human capacities. The language of Christian eschatological hope is able to hold in tension that which we can accomplish with God, with an awareness that the fullness of healing has still not yet arrived. A Christian eschatological vision expands the grounds for human hope beyond the limits of human achievement, such that we can affirm the fragmentary and partial achievements of personal, interpersonal, and social political healing as mediations of God's promise of salvation for creation, without needing to restrict our imaginative vision to what appears possible merely through human ends. This allows us to lift up small successes as participating in God's desire for the world. So we can lift up things like extending statutes of limitations for prosecuting sexual abuse crimes, while still holding on to far-flung visions of a world in which rape is unthinkable and prosecution guidelines might be one day unnecessary. I long for the day that Christians can stop talking about traumatic suffering as a vehicle for God's saving grace. Instead, God's grace is operative in and through the process of healing from everything that wounds us. These processes are at once mystical and political, since they draw us closer to God and they transform our collective lives. We have yet to experience the fullness of post-traumatic healing. That is full freedom from the grip of rape culture. We wait for this transformation in hope. And while we wait, we mourn, we protest, and we imagine a new future with courage. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Fetter, for this introduction to your book and for this wonderful book. As somebody who's read it and has shared sections of it with our students here at St. Mary's, I just cannot recommend it enough. So congratulations. I was struck as you were sharing by the ubiquity of sexual violence, both in your sharing of your own personal connections to this issue and the statistics that you shared with us. And that called to mind a passage from the foreword of this book, which was written by a friend and fellow theologian, Donna Freitas. And there she notes, quote, "The area of sexual assault, trauma, and healing, especially within the context of theology and spirituality, is a domain that many scholars still hesitate to enter," end quote. When I was reading the introduction, this struck me as true, that there's still a lot of hesitancy to address this issue. And that seems a scandal to me in light of the statistics that you shared with us. So I'm wondering if you could say a bit about why you think so many people are still hesitant to address this topic in theology and spirituality, and maybe say a little bit more about why you decided to do it nevertheless.
Yeah, thanks for engaging this work. I'm really grateful for this opportunity to have this conversation. I think, as I was doing the research for this book, the common statistics about how frequent sexual violence happens in people's lives changed dramatically. So when I first started the research for this about 12 years ago, it was commonly thought that about 1 in 4 women experience sexual violence in their lifetime. And for men, it was something unimaginable, like 1 in 73 or so. I forget what it used to be. Excuse me. And over the course of me writing this, it went from 1 in 4 to 1 in 3 for women, and now it's more than half. And that has really struck me, being at a women's college, that more than half of us have experienced sexual violence that involves physical contact. And at the same time, I've also been doing this other research project that largely focuses on men who are survivors of clergy sexual abuse, and in particular, that didn't involve physical contact, but involved some very serious forms of stalking and sexual exploitation. And so I went through this process of understanding over time how profoundly common this is. And I think we don't want to know that. I mean, for our own well-being, we don't want to know that. We don't want to believe that we live in a world in which it's more common than not for women to have this kind of experience. That's just a horrifying world to live in. And so I think that we have, some safety mechanisms that are in place in our own minds and hearts to try to compartmentalize that reality. And so I think that's a big part of it.
You also mentioned in your presentation that you're convinced that the work of psychology is not sufficient for addressing the reality of sexual trauma. And in the book itself, you do a really remarkable job of engaging psychology as well as sociologists and other scholars of sexual violence. So it's clear to me that you see great value in how these other disciplines are addressing sexual trauma. But you also think that theology has something unique to offer. Could you say a bit more about how you see these other disciplines bringing important insights to your work as a theologian, and then also how you want to complement what they're doing from your own perspective in Catholic theology?
Yeah, I have been so grateful to a whole host of interdisciplinary forms of research in psychology, but also philosophy. I mean, people are doing some excellent work, feminist philosophies of sexual violence. And I think that these fields have really taught me so much about the depth of harm that is caused by this kind of violence, the interrelated sites of wounding, and also the importance of relationship in recovery. What I didn't find in these other fields was a reason to persist in the work of healing when it's very difficult and progress is not. I mean, we don't live in a world in which we have a progressive view of history as an illusion, right? And so we don't even, it's not like things have gotten better for, people over time, or we've set up all of these structures and things are incrementally getting safer. That's not even true. And so why do we keep holding on? And I think that the Christian language of courage can give us a language to talk about what holding on in the face of difficult but good things can look like. And I think the language of eschatological hope can give us a sense of what it means to genuinely expect something better and live and act as if that's possible, and still also be realistic about what humans can accomplish. And I don't want to say this in such a way that suggests it's like a strategic good or something like that. Like this is a way of giving ourselves a pep talk. But I genuinely have found these ideas grounding and animating for myself as I've done this work. And I think that it can really be grounding and illuminating for our communities that struggle to survive.
We have applause in the room. Yes. Amen. I'm really struck as you talk about the need for hope in the face of the slowness of healing, the kind of monumental reality of sexual violence and healing from it. And I'm reminded of a conversation that I find myself having with students over and over again, which is often when we're convinced that something is wrong and we turn to, okay, what are we going to do about it? I very quickly hear from students often like, well, we can't convince everybody that this is a problem and we're not going to agree that it's a solution. So having this kind of hope is maybe impractical. So I think the need for the kind of eschatological vision that you're offering us is there and is really important. I'm also thinking about your emphasis in the book on the collective dimensions of healing, particularly because we often think of sexual trauma as something that the victim survivor herself has to deal with, maybe her and a therapist or something. Would you tell us more about how this healing vision that you're casting is a collective enterprise?
In some ways, I first started thinking about this because Judith Herman, the very important trauma psychiatrist, has this mantra in her text: no one survives trauma alone. But as I thought about that, I realized that's also a deep insight in our own Christian tradition, that no one exists alone. No one worships God alone. No one comes into the fullness of who she is alone. And I think that is one of the deepest gifts of the Christian tradition, is that insight that we don't exist alone, and our well-being doesn't just depend on us. Sexual violence is an interpersonal kind of harm originally, and the greatest sense of wounding that we can have as we're struggling to survive are these ongoing sites of interpersonal connection. And so I really was moved as I explored ideas about Christian friendship as a way to think about healing, to kind of almost dramatize or put kind of Christian imagery on this idea that no one survives trauma alone, that we heal in friendship with God and with each other. And I was really moved by Teresa's own vision of, and she's not unique in this way, but, she, like so many other Christian reformers and thinkers in the Christian tradition, wanted to create communities where women lived together and depended on each other and were free to have authentic friendships with each other, where things like class distinction and honor, and codes of blood purity and things like that wouldn't stand in the way of real and authentic friendship. And she believed that that was transformative. And that's been my experience too.
As the subtitle of your book emphasizes, this is a theology of healing. And that's been at the center of your remarks today. And it strikes me that there are other theologians who work on trauma who have actually cautioned us against this focus on healing, right? Insofar as trauma is a condition that's defined by the recurrence and persistence of suffering, they say, when Christians focus so much on healing, we're setting up trauma survivors for failure, for false hope that God is just going to swoop in and fix them. And when that doesn't happen, often it can be really, really disheartening for trauma survivors. So they say, less talk of healing. Christians should focus on supporting survivors in other ways. I'm curious how you are positioning your theology of healing in relation to these other conversations in trauma. Why offer a theology of healing in light of the kind of caution against this focus?
Yeah, and that's a great summary. And I'll also add from secular psychological literature, there's also this caution about the term healing. And that's a lot in part where Christian trauma theologians are pulling from when they feel cautious about thinking about healing. And there's good reason for that. Post-traumatic life is always marked by trauma. I mean, there's an ongoing site of woundedness, and our sites of woundedness define who we are over time. And to talk about healing it can sometimes suggest that there's a way in which we're expecting to be cured, as if there was never an experience of violence at all, that we could go back to some, pure state if that ever existed. But I think there are a couple reasons that I think that just leaving it at that and saying, okay, we're not going to talk about healing at all. We're only going to, some folks say we should just use the term recovery instead, maybe. I think that the Christian tradition actually has the capacity to reclaim the term healing as an ongoing, a healing, something that's ongoing process, that's lifelong or more than lifelong. If we think about healing in an eschatological key, so if we think about salvation as something that we've already experienced, that's already been accomplished in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, and yet it's not complete, we can also think about salvation in our own lives as something that's already started, that we can experience healing, we can experience wholeness, and there's always going to be a proviso. And that expectation, that awareness that salvation or healing is not yet complete for us, is, I think, something, as a space, I think that the Christian tradition can hold open. And so I don't want to get rid of this expectation of the fullness of healing. I think that it's important for us to have an imaginative capacity to envision a world in which rape would be unthinkable. And I think that that's something that God wants for us. And I think that that's something that we want for ourselves too.
I've got one or maybe two more questions for you, but I want to give our audience members a heads up. You'll have a chance to ask your own questions in a moment. So start thinking on that. But before we turn things over, I've long admired you not only as a really rigorous academic thinker, but also as a theologian for the church. I know you to be somebody who cares very deeply about the lived realities of the Christian community and questions of how our theologies sort of hit the ground. And I think that's apparent certainly in the book and in your presentation today. So I wanted to ask you, how would you like to see church communities or Catholic institutions like ours put your theology into practice?
That's a great question. I think that the first thing that I'm hoping for is an honesty about the pervasive reality of sexual violence, and an honesty about the deep wounding that sexual violence creates. So, we do have this instinctive tendency to want to shut our eyes to this reality because it makes this is a difficult world to live in. But I think that it begins with transparency and honesty about what our experiences are like. And I think that that kind of honesty can happen on an institutional level by first and foremost being honest about the ways in which we've supported and normalized perpetration. I think that we need to have an honest accounting of the ways in which our institutions have housed and supported and erased responsibility for perpetrators. And I think that's a really good place to start. I think that we can also do some good work, good imagination work, and try to imagine what might our communities look like if we didn't have to tell children as they grow up to be careful and scared all the time about protecting themselves. I want us to think collectively about what that might look like. And I want us to try to imagine what childhood could look like with that. And I want us to imagine what adult sexual relationships could look like without that fear. I want to imagine what it could look like for women to be able to be free about their own bodies in a world like that. And to imagine artistically and philosophically and sociologically in all of our disciplines, like what that world could look like.
It's a beautiful call to imagination. With that, I want to invite folks here in the room or online to offer your questions for Dr. Fetter. If you're here in the room, you can just raise your hand. We have a couple folks running through the aisles with microphones. If you're online, you can submit those to the Q&A button on the Zoom.
Hi, I just was kind of wondering how you might respond to someone that would say that a lack of sex education in many Christian communities kind of aids in the difficulty of healing of people who have experienced sexual violence.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great first question, especially to build on this last question that Dr. Coblentz just asked. I think that really honest and comprehensive forms of sex education play a really important role in both prevention and healing. If we can know how our bodies work, and also if that kind of sex education can provide some strategies for navigating relationships well and asking for things like consent, practicing safe forms of sex. These are all really important life skills, and our lives would be a lot better if more people knew how to do those things.
I'm curious your stance in response to people who talk about how in Christianity, it's preached that forgiveness is like a really big thing, and how like fostering hate and not forgiving people and yourselves like makes you like less of a person. So like, what was your response to victims who like can't find it in themselves to forgive?
Yeah, that's also a great question. You guys are doing great. I think that this, we have a Christian obsession with forgiveness that is not helpful. And I think that, to the extent I don't know that it's very helpful to talk about forgiveness at all in this kind of context, but to the extent that it is, I think what psychologists tell me about that is that in their work with trauma survivors, most of the forgiveness work actually has to do with the trauma survivor forgiving herself or undoing the scripts that she has internalized that place blame on her, and to rewrite some of those narratives that suggest to her that she played some role in what happened to her. I think that honesty about what has happened is most important. And in the Christian tradition, forgiveness is a gift that's given to us by God. And so it's not something that the survivor can just like will herself into feeling. But instead, it's something that maybe God gives sometimes to people to have a little distance. And sometimes we don't receive that kind of gift. And I think leaning into feelings of anger and frustration about sexual violence are also gifts from God. Those feelings of anger and frustration are also God's gifts to us to indicate that which should have never happened to us. And so I think that often this narrative to kind of shame survivors into saying, well, you shouldn't really be feeling that way is ignoring the gifts that angry survivors have, which is righteous anger about something which should have never happened. And that anger is an insight, it's a clarity, and it's a truth about the kind of world that God does want for us, a world in which something like that would never happen.
Hi. Are there any specific places in the Bible that come to mind that could help survivors who struggle with God-centered rationalization?
That's a good question. Sort of drawing a blank. I think that we have in the gospel traditions, we have narratives about Jesus's life and ministry that give us a portrait of the kind of well-being and flourishing that God wants for us. So if we think about the healing work that Jesus did during his lifetime and the table fellowship, the kind of eating practices that Jesus had during his lifetime that are tested to throughout all four Gospels, we have a lot of resources to reflect on the reality that God wants our well-being, that wants us to live in healthy relationship with each other, and God doesn't want us to suffer. God wants to bring about a kingdom in which all of us are free to be honored and respected as whole human beings, and each of us has a place at God's table.
Hello. I was wondering what your thoughts would be on somebody who was maybe like assaulted by a clergy member, how they would go about healing through religious practices, since it might be a resurgence of any trauma each time they try to like go to church or restart their religious faith.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think that healing is always very specific for each one of us. And so it's very common that religious leaders will use religious imagery, use religious language, use religious objects to commit sexual violence. And it's very difficult to return to the tradition in which you were abused to experience God's healing. And so I would really encourage survivors of clergy abuse to find community and to find and to not feel like they need to do any one particular Christian practice. God's grace is can reach us even if we never go to mass, right? God's grace can reach us if we never participate in the sacramental life of the church. But that grace always happens, always is communicated to us through relationship. So we need to find some way of finding community and relationship and support through that healing, is what I would say.
Do you think that your theology of healing could lead to a redefinition of forgiveness with the communal mindset?
Tell me more.
Oh gosh. Well, you were mentioning how that when people are in community and in these faith communities, it's this collective idea of healing. Do you think that your theology of healing in this collective could lead to a different way we view forgiveness in our faith tradition?
Yeah. I really have been moved by the work that Marie Fortune has done on forgiveness. She reclaims this idea that forgiveness is really about like letting go of something, like almost like it's probably better for us to think of the imagery of divorcing something than like feeling happy and butterflies about it again, right? Or embracing our perpetrator. And I think the communal work of reconciliation that needs to happen in communities in which sexual violence has happened first has to begin with transparency and honesty and restoring agency to survivors. So I think we often want to cut that process short, where we, want to kind of, have a mantra of, well, this is personnel information. We don't need to talk about this, or we don't need to disclose all of these details. But often survivors want to know exactly what happened to them, what kinds of forms of accountability have been enacted, and what forms of accountability are we still waiting for. And we can't begin that process of communal reconciliation without information first and without listening to what survivors want. So I guess I think the term like reconciliation could be reclaimed. It's hard to imagine forgiveness as a term being really like a useful term there. But I think there are communal forms of restitution that can be made, and truth telling and responsibility that can be taken.
So, how, as like a Christian community in our own church, how can we bring these difficult topics to light as just like a normal person without any position of power? Or how do we make our churches more transparent in the community?
That's a great question. I think that it's hard. And I think that I think in communities where there are such discrepancies in power, it makes that difficult. And I think the first thing is maybe just to name that as a reality, that it is difficult in Catholic context for lay people to do as much work towards healing as they can, because the limitations on lay people's capacity for leadership, I think, poses real problems. I also think that there's a lot of power in asking questions. There's a lot of power in being annoying. There's a lot of power in claiming agency where you can. And so starting, like small faith sharing groups, or the equivalent of, in the second wave feminist movement, feminists did things called consciousness raising groups, where they would get together and they would talk about their experiences, and they discovered, oh my gosh, we're all like have these same things happening to us, like maybe we should organize, right? And so I think there are some ways for people in parish life, even without formal approval, to organize, to share their own experiences, to ask questions, and to envision what kinds of new programming or structures could come into reality.
All right, we have a question from online. She says, "Hi, my name is Hillary. I wonder about what resources you have found most useful to you in understanding trauma and what survivors need for support. If any come to mind on the spot, would you be able to share suggestions for how those interested in learning more?"
Yeah, I think for understanding trauma in and of itself, I can't recommend enough the work of Judith Herman. I think she's just really brilliant and moving person working in the field of psychiatry, who really dramatizes the ways in which traumatic violence is not just a personal issue, or not something that just affects individuals, but has political and social components to that reality, and that healing is never really complete unless it involves a full political and social transformation of rape culture. I could also just, show my love for so many fellow trauma theologians who are really wonderful and doing excellent work. It's a really supportive community, actually, and one that's, I think, I think it's one that's moved by relationships that are, deep friendships. And I think that really dramatizes some of the reality of what healing looks like too. So, maybe look in the bibliography. I don't, but there's a lot of good stuff. I'm not sure where to start with that.
Hi. So, do you think that educating people on the repercussions of sexual trauma, like mental disorders, will decrease the stigma on these repercussions and prevent sexual assault from happening, and even help people see sexual trauma less of karma and more on the perpetrator's choices?
Could you repeat that very last part?
And help people see sexual trauma less based on karma and more on the perpetrator's choices.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. I think that, I think that we have a lot of work to do to remind ourselves all the time that sexual violence is the result of perpetrators' actions. And I think one outcome from trauma education can be to make that more visible and make that more intelligible to all of us, and keep that in the forefront of our consciousness. I don't know if it will help a lot with prevention, but I think it can help us a lot with recovery and healing after the fact. I think, maybe more people knowing that this isn't a reality can help to empower bystanders to act quickly and to dismantle situations before they get violent. Maybe that can help with prevention. But in either instance, I think that's really important work that does need to happen.
We have time for maybe one more question. So last but not least.
In your research and writing process, were there any challenges that you encountered that significantly shaped the final content of your book?
Yeah, I think, it was important to me to include a lot of survivor narratives in the book, but that meant that I needed to read a lot of those. And that was really difficult. And to cope with that over a very long process of writing this book, I really needed to rely on the relationships in my own life to be able to be healthy, both in terms of like reaching out to other great theologians in the field who are doing work on tricky things like this, asking them for help about, like, what can I do in my life to stay healthy? What can I, and so that process of reaching out in friendship to others for support actually shaped, I think, a lot of what the text looked like in my emphasis on friendship in the text, actually. And it really taught me that no one survives alone. And so that was a meaningful experience for me in actually writing the book.
Well, please join me in thanking Dr. Feder and Dr. Coblentz. Just a few announcements before we go. First, to extend some additional thanks to Miss Rebecca Holm and Miss Maria Dock, who work at the Center for the Study of Spirituality and have been running our live stream and helping with the microphones. All of you who have joined us in person online, we extend our thanks to you. And a reminder, especially to our online viewers, to visit stmarys.edu/spirituality to learn more about upcoming events and programs. And I'll give a little spoiler alert right here. We heard Dr. Feder speak several times now about the work of the psychiatrist, Dr. Judith Herman. We have a special event in March where she'll be joining us for a conversation with Dr. Feder herself. So stay tuned, visit that website to learn more. A reminder as well that we have our bookstore in the atrium where Dr. Feder will be happy to chat with folks and to sign books for those who'd like to buy them. And finally, join me one more time in thanking Dr. Feder and Dr. Coblentz.